Hey! Hi everyone, it's me, Max. It's been so long since I've done one of these videos, okay? So this is a book video, finally. My last one was a few months back. I did one about what books I'd read for university. And this one is a pretty topical one because Happy New Year, everyone! 2024, the year of the gamer. These are my favourite books that I've read in 2023. I read about 23 books, that's what it says on Goodreads. I mostly enjoyed a lot of what I read this year. I'm going to try and read more for next year, but these are the books that I enjoyed the most that I read this year, in no particular order whatsoever. These are just the however many that is. Just a handful of books that I really loved this year. I started off the year with a bang, as one of the first books that I read this year was Goodbye Columbus by Philip Roth. I have a bit of a complicated relationship with Philip Roth, or at least did at this point in time. He's an author that I really love thematically, and I love the way he writes, but everything I've read by him is either really good or I just don't enjoy it as much. I loved this book, but I thought Portnoy's Complaint was, whilst good, a bit over the top in how long it was, I think is a good way of saying it. I thought it was a lot longer than it needed to be. And Zuckerman Unbound I kind of read on a whim, and apparently that's actually the sequel to The Ghostwriter, which I'm yet to read. But this was his first novel, published in 1959, Goodbye Columbus, along with some other short stories, which I didn't actually read those, I just read Goodbye Columbus. It follows a guy named Neil who falls in love with a woman named Brenda. Neil's a sort of very working class sort of guy, and Brenda's this very stereotypical Jewish American princess, sort of well-off. You know, she has a well-off father, and it's basically about their fling they had together, their relationship. Philip Roth was Jewish, so his work really examines lots of themes of different types of Judaism. So, for example, both these protagonists are Jewish, but they come from different backgrounds pertaining to the American Jewish experience. It's a very, very well-written book. It's a very simple book, incredibly easy story, but it's a really good, very cynical look at dating and relationships, I guess. This is from 1959, and I think a lot of the core themes still hold up. My favourite part of this book were the scenes where Neil is working at the library, especially when there's this little black kid who comes in and keeps asking to read stuff, and he sort of sees that other people who own the library a bit prejudiced towards the kid, essentially. Great movie as well, from 1969, I want to say, directed by Larry Pierce, starring Richard Benjamin and Ali MacGraw, and Jack Klugman. That's a good movie. Next is a book I read for university and I talked about in the last video. It's The Lone Ranger and Tonto Fist Fight in Heaven by Sherman Alexie. Side note, I had a dream last night that his name was changed. It was like Sherman something else, or like it was the other way around. That was weird. Anyway, this is a fantastic book that is essentially a short story collection of a bunch of characters who live on a reservation. You know, a Native American Indigenous people reservation. And it basically showcases different characters and stories pertaining to Indigenous American life. Lots of storytelling, lots of culture, and it's a very, very eye-opening experience. However, it's not alienating to those who don't know about these cultures because it actually shows how, unfortunately, these people have had to assimilate to American culture so much. There's so many references to pop culture and really lots of passages which could kind of come out as if they weren't written with this ethnic background in mind. It's a really, really good book, and it's very, very clearly angry with the situation that Indigenous Americans are put into, very rightfully so. But it's never too on the nose about things. It's always very clever. You know, it's just a very well-written book. Unfortunately, Sherman Alexie's not a great guy. Apparently, he was like accused of sexual harassment, so I'm not endorsing the guy. I'm endorsing the book. I think this is an excellent short story collection. My personal favourite short stories in this collection are A Drug Called Tradition, because my father always said he was the only Indian who saw Jimi Hendrix play Star Spangled Banner at Woodstock or something along those lines. Yeah, I nailed it. This Is What It Means to Say Phoenix, Arizona, All I Wanted to Do Was Dance, and The Title Story, which is a beautiful, beautiful telling of loneliness that comes after a relationship breaks down. This is an excellent, excellent book, and I highly implore everyone who's never heard of this to go out and read it, because I think it is pretty much something that could appeal to most people. I also talked about this one in my university books video. This is In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. This is excellent. This is like the first true crime novel. It essentially followed Truman Capote and Harper Lee as they investigated this murder in a Kansas town, and he recounts from interviews and things he's learned by talking to people in the town, what happens in the build-up to the murder and the aftermath, including time he spent with the two murderers behind it. It's a very, very tragic and dark book, but it's very beautiful and it's very well written. Truman Capote is a master at prose. He weaves this story so beautifully between just the most genius words that you've ever read. He really, really knows how to capture your attention and keep your attention. This is a 4-chapter book. It goes on for a long time, and I had no issue reading it whatsoever because it is just purely stunning from start to finish. It is a fantastic work of fiction. Well, work of non-fiction, actually. Work of creative non-fiction. We'll leave that in, it'll be too hard to write out. So I really, really like this book. There's a film as well, which starred Robert Blake, who is one of the murderers who in real life did actually kill his wife, which is a very bizarre turn of events. It perfectly captures this desolate feeling of the 1960s or 50s, I can't remember, it's the very end of the 50s or the early 60s when this was written. It was published in 67, but I knew it took him a long time to actually, be published from when he started writing it. And it's just a beautiful, dark, desolate book, and I think it really, really paints a good, vivid image of this whole case which happened in the town, and is the gold standard for reporting on crime, and for creative non-fiction, and for journalism in general. I would say this is the book to go for. In Halloween, I tried something a bit out of my comfort zone, and I read Christine by Stephen King. I've never read Stephen King books, although I've always respected the guy as an author and think he's a very interesting person. I'm not really one who reads genre fiction, high epic fantasy, sci-fi and horror stories. You guys know the kind of books I like, even though I love science fiction movies and TV and horror movies and TV. So I thought, why not pick up Christine? Because I've seen the film, so I'm vaguely aware of the plot, and I absolutely love this book. I think Stephen King is such a talented storyteller. His prose isn't the most dense or the most flowery, but he really, really can grab you in and tell a very easy to understand book. This book is quite long, as are so many of his works, yet you don't feel the length because they feel so quick to read. I absolutely went flying through these last few chapters of the book when I read them because it just keeps you there, it pulls you in. It's great, it's tense, and it's got a great, great aesthetic to it too as well. There's a lot of references to small town Americana in the 70s and 80s, and references to old rock and roll music and such, which is when the Plymouth Fury was, the car in the book was made. And on top of all this, it's not just a scary story about a scary car, it's a very well told story about obsession and loss and melancholic childhood and youthful romance and all these things. And I think to narrow it down to a scary car like the John Carpenter movie does is an absolute disservice to what makes this book so good. Stephen King is a great horror writer, but what makes him so great is the fact that he isn't just a horror writer. He's a writer who happens to write horror, which is something that honestly genre fiction needs more of. The last book I'm going to mention here in my top 5 is A Confederate General from Big Sur by Richard Brautigan. I read this book for the first time a few days ago. I got it for Christmas and I flew through it, and it is absolutely genius. The best way I could describe it is Ernest Hemingway meets Richard Farina meets Jack Kerouac. It's a perfect hippie tale of two guys in the late 1950s who hang around, they sleep around. That's all they do, really. There's kind of an underlying mystery with the titular Confederate general. One of the main characters, Lee Mellon, believes that his relative was a Confederate general. However, he can't find any record of him existing. But for the most part, it's a fairly plotless book. It's a no plot, all vibes type story. And I think there are a lot of vibes here. It's funny, very funny. I laughed several times while reading this. And it's just so simplistic yet creative. Richard Brautigan uses the most insane similes and metaphors you've ever heard. It's really, honestly, bewildering that a human being could come up with this kind of stuff. It's, from start to finish, a quick, easy read that is so creative and so genius. And I think it's really quite nice that the best book I read this year was one of the last books I read this year. This is amazing and I can't recommend it enough. I can't wait to delve into more Richard Brautigan stuff. I've already read Trout Fishing in America, and I think he might become on the path to become a new favourite writer. For those unaware, Richard Brautigan wrote the book In Watermelon Sugar, which a certain singer took to name a very famous song. Brautigan is an icon of the countercultural hippie movement, and very similar to Richard Farina, he unfortunately was sort of young when he died. He committed suicide in the early 1980s. But this book is stunning. It's just read it, highly recommend. I've also started buying really just secondhand in general, and this was a great, I think, secondhand book. And you can really feel, you need to read like countercultural type stuff in hippie books secondhand. You can't buy a new, it doesn't work. Anyway, that's all my favourite books I read this year. Not every single book I read this year, obviously. I could do a whole one of those, but there's a lot I don't have much to say about. A quick really a few others I like that I read this year off the top of my head. I enjoyed reading They Shoot Horses, Don't They? by Horace McCoy, that was great. Sport and a Pastime by James Salter, that was an enjoyable book as well. And I read The Big Sleep by Raymond Chandler, which was good to finally get around to reading that. That was quite a good book. I also did start reading some short stories by David Foster Wallace and Raymond Carver, sorry, but I didn't finish those books in their entirety. And I did a video very early in the year on the channel where I talked about some books I'd read recently then. So The Sun Always Rises, or Sun Also Rises, sorry, by Ernest Hemingway was on there, and Mao 2 by Don DeLillo. Those are the books that I'd like to give an honorable mention. Happy New Year, everyone. I'm gonna hopefully try and make more videos in that time. Share the video around, do whatever. I appreciate all of you watching this, and I hope you've enjoyed the content I've produced in this last year. See ya, and stay beautiful.